At 4:45 a.m., the radios were still quiet. No celebration, no announcement. Just a single line appearing on a situation map that had not been there the night before. Entire Soviet formations were no longer moving, not retreating, not advancing, just gone. At first, no one trusted the report. On the Eastern Front, confusion was normal. Units disappeared all the time, only to reappear hours later in the wrong place, under the wrong command, with the wrong orders. But this was different. The silence was too wide, the gap too clean. Something enormous had stopped breathing. Summer. 1941. Operation Barbarossa was barely weeks old, and already the war had outrun its own plans. German armies had advanced faster than anyone believed possible, but now that speed was becoming a liability. Supply lines stretched thin, fuel was rationed by the hour, commanders were warned not to improvise, not to chase annihilation at the cost of control. The doctrine was clear. Keep moving east, keep pressure on Moscow, do not fracture the advance. Yet the southern front was swelling with enemy mass. Hundreds of thousands of Soviet troops were clustered around a critical bend of the Dnieper River. On paper, they were still alive, still armed, still dangerous. On the map, they were a problem no one wanted to touch. Inside a forward headquarters, a senior German commander stood over that map without speaking. He did not pace. He did not argue. He watched the lines, the way. A surgeon watches a pulse. Others talked around him. Staff officers warned about overextension. Logistics officers pointed to fuel columns already running late. Allied commanders cautioned restraint. This was not the moment for risk. This was the moment for discipline. But discipline is a system. War is not. What he saw was not a mass of enemy troops. He saw time. He saw delay. He saw a door that was still open, but only for a few hours longer. If the enemy realized what was forming, they would escape east. If higher command intervened, the moment would be lost. And if nothing was done, that concentration would one day break free and tear open the German flank. The order that followed did not sound dramatic. It was not shouted. It was not justified. It did not ask for consensus. It simply redirected the weight of an entire army group away from its original objective and towards something far more dangerous, a turning movement that had no guarantee of success and no margin for failure. Armored columns began changing direction before the ink on the orders was dry. Infantry units were told to march through the night. Fuel allocations were rewritten on the fly. Maps were updated every few hours, then every few minutes. This was not an attack. It was a race. And races are decided before anyone realizes they have started. On the other side of the lines, Soviet reports lagged behind reality. Signals moved slowly. Assumptions moved faster than facts. What appeared to be a temporary German adjustment was in fact a closing mechanism. But by the time that became clear, the exits were narrowing. Back at headquarters, the map no longer showed movement. It showed pressure. Two arcs bending inward, a space shrinking by the hour. Staff officers stared at it in silence, aware that if the calculation was wrong, this decision would end careers. Perhaps the campaign itself. And if it was right, the war in the South would never look the same again. The pressure did not exist in isolation. It was born from geography, timing, and fear. By early August 1941, the Eastern Front had become too wide for certainty. German forces had smashed through border defenses and driven deep into Soviet territory. But the advance had created a new problem space. The deeper the armies moved, the harder it became to control what was left behind. And what remained behind them in the south was not empty land. It was manpower, rail lines, river crossings. Entire Soviet field armies clustered around one of the most important cities in the region. Kiev was more than a dot on a map. It was the anchor of southern Soviet defense, a logistical hub tied to rail corridors, feeding the heart of Ukraine. Lose it, and the Red Army would lose cohesion across the entire southern sector. Hold it, and Germany risked fighting with a loaded flank, exposed to counterattack at any moment. From Berlin, the guidance was blunt. Speed mattered more than encirclement. The war, it was believed, would be decided by momentum, not perfection. Every day spent turning south was a day not spent advancing east. Every division redirected was fuel burned, time lost, and risk multiplied. The system wanted certainty, straight lines, predictable advances. But certainty did not exist on this front. Intelligence reports arriving from the south were alarming. Soviet formations were not collapsing. They were consolidating. Reinforcements were moving in from deeper reserves. What looked like a pocket waiting to be bypassed was in reality a loaded spring. If unleashed, it could strike north, cut supply routes, and force German armies into a defensive war they were never designed to fight. The contradiction was clear. Doctrine demanded forward motion. Reality demanded containment. One could not have both. Inside headquarters, maps were repinned and repinned again. Rail capacity was calculated down to the hour. Fuel consumption was projected against distance and terrain. Staff officers argued not about whether the enemy was dangerous, but about whether it was even possible to deal with them without breaking the entire campaign. The tension was not emotional, it was mathematical. Every option carried a price. Ignore the mass and risk disaster later, or turn now and gamble everything on speed and coordination. There would be no gradual adjustment. Once the movement began, it could not be paused without collapsing under its own weight. Outside, the armies kept moving unaware that the direction of the war was being decided not by fire, but by a calculation made under flickering lights over a map that refused to stay still. The situation was no longer about winning ground. It was about preventing catastrophe. And somewhere between doctrine and instinct, the window for action was closing. Doctrine existed to prevent chaos. It reduced war to principles, rules, margins of safety. On paper, it was the only thing standing between momentum and collapse. The doctrine governing this front was explicit. Armored forces were not to be split while advancing at depth. Encirclement was desirable, but only when conditions were ideal. Fuel had to be secured. Infantry had to be close enough to hold what armor seized. Air cover had to be predictable. Anything less was considered reckless, a violation of the very system that had delivered victory so far. Logistics reinforced the warning. Rail lines lagged far behind the spearheads. Trucks were already running double shifts. Fuel convoys arrived hours late, sometimes days. Every kilometer added multiplied strain. Turning south would not shorten the war. It would bend it. And bends break supply chains. The staff knew this. The planners knew this. The system was built to say no. There were also political realities pressing in. Higher command wanted symbols. Capitals mattered. Direction mattered. A straight drive east was easy to explain, easy to justify, easy to defend if it failed. A massive turning movement aimed not at a city, but at an army carried no such protection. If it stalled, it would look like indecision. If it failed, it would be blamed on the man who ordered it. This was the hidden weight of doctrine. It did not just shape tactics. It shaped careers. It shaped reputations. It shaped which risks were acceptable and which were unforgivable. Inside the headquarters, resistance was quiet but firm. Maps were marked with red warnings. Fuel estimates were underlined. Timetables were circled. No one shouted. No one needed to. The numbers spoke for themselves. And yet the numbers also betrayed the system. They assumed the enemy would behave predictably. They assumed delays would be symmetrical. They assumed reactions would be timely. None of that was true. On this front, information moved slower than armor. Orders moved slower than reality. A doctrine built on balance was facing an opponent drowning in imbalance. What the system called recklessness, the moment demanded urgency. The conflict was no longer between armies. It was between a framework designed for control and a situation defined by acceleration. Every hour spent debating increased the chance that the enemy would slip away. Every request for confirmation narrowed the window. The system wanted certainty before movement. The battlefield offered movement before certainty. At the center of this contradiction stood one commander absorbing the friction from every direction. Doctrine pressed from above. Logistics pressed from below. Time pressed from everywhere. The rules said wait. The map said move. And the longer the system argued with itself, the more obvious it became that doing nothing was also a decision. He had seen wars slow down before. He had seen them freeze, stall, collapse under their own weight. What he had never trusted was the idea that a war this large could be steered purely by rules. In the headquarters, there was no dramatic confrontation, no raised voices, no speeches. The room was too experienced for that. Men who had served through earlier campaigns understood that this was not a debate meant to be won. It was a pressure meant to be absorbed. The commander stood apart from the table now, not because he wanted distance, but because he needed silence. He did not stare at the entire front. He narrowed his focus to one sector, one bend of river, one dense cluster of symbols that represented hundreds of thousands of men who believed they still had time. He was not thinking in terms of glory or annihilation. Those words belonged to politics. What occupied his mind was simpler and colder. Timing, reaction, human delay. He understood something the system could not easily quantify. Large organizations move slowly, especially when they are afraid. Orders are questioned, confirmations are demanded, responsibility is passed upward. By the time a retreat is approved, the opportunity to retreat is often already gone. This was not intuition, it was pattern recognition. The enemy's strength was obvious. Their vulnerability was not weakness, but inertia. Too many units, too many commanders, too many layers between observation and action. They would not run at the first sign of danger. They would wait. And waiting in war can be fatal. The commander returned to the table and placed a finger on the map. Not on a city, not on a capital. On the space between two formations. A seam, thin, temporary, already closing. He did not explain his reasoning in detail. He did not need to. Anyone who had watched him long enough understood that when he went quiet, the decision was already made. This was the moment where systems usually reassert control, where caution intervenes, where doctrine slows impulse. But this time the system had no answer for the question in front of it. What happens if the enemy never gets the chance to realize what is happening? The commander knew the risk. If the movement failed, there would be no excuse that could save it. He would own the outcome entirely. Success would be credited to inevitability. Failure would be personal. He accepted that imbalance without hesitation. Orders began to move outward, measured, precise, irreversible. Not aggressive commands, but directional ones. A shift, a convergence, a quiet tightening that would only become obvious when it was too late to reverse. Around the table, officers sensed the change. The debate had ended without being declared over. The system had been overridden not by force, but by responsibility. Outside engines were already warming. The decision did not announce itself. It simply began to take shape in motion. Orders left headquarters without ceremony, carried by couriers and crackling radios. Units were not told why the direction had changed. They were told when. They were told where. And they were told to move without waiting for alignment from neighboring formations. Coordination would happen on the road, not in the briefing room. This was the risk, not the enemy, not the distance, the absence of guarantees. Armored columns pivoted south while their maps were still being redrawn. Drivers followed compass bearings more than roads. Infantry units marched under blackout conditions, stepping past abandoned villages, crossing bridges that had not been tested for weight. Fuel allocations were recalculated in real time. Some units were given just enough to reach the next objective, with no promise of resupply beyond it. Nothing about this movement fit the system's preference for control. The commander knew exactly what he was asking. He was committing forces before the battlefield had stabilized, before reconnaissance had finished, before the enemy's disposition was fully confirmed. This was not patience, it was compression, a decision made to steal time from the opponent before time could be taken back. There was a moment, brief, dangerous, when everything was exposed. Flanks stretched thin, gaps opened where no one was certain who would fill them. If the enemy struck hard and fast in that window, the maneuver could collapse inward, turning audacity into disaster. But the enemy did not strike. They hesitated. Reports filtering in from the other side described confusion. Commands were delayed. Units waited for clarification that never arrived. What looked like a temporary German adjustment was misread as overextension. The moment passed unnoticed. Inside headquarters, updates arrived by the hour. Not victories, distances, timings. Junctions reached earlier than expected. Bridges taken intact. Resistance lighter than projected. Each small success reduced the number of ways the decision could still fail. Yet no one relaxed. The commander did not celebrate progress. He watched the clock. This phase was not about combat. It was about convergence. Two moving arms had to arrive within a narrow margin of time. Too fast and they would outrun support. Too slow and the enemy would slip through. The entire maneuver balanced on synchronization measured in hours, not days. Higher command began asking questions. Why had forces shifted? Why was fuel being drawn forward so aggressively? The answers were technical, deliberately incomplete. By the time the full picture could be assembled from above, the geometry on the ground would already be fixed. That was the final layer of risk. Acting not just ahead of the enemy, but ahead of one's own system. As night fell, columns continued to move. Engines were kept running. Orders were updated mid-march. Officers learned objectives as they approached them. This was not how campaigns were supposed to unfold. It was how windows were exploited. The commander remained at the map, tracking progress with minimal marks. No sweeping gestures, no reassurances. He understood that the decision was still alive. It could still be undone by weather, by miscommunication, by a single counterstroke in the wrong place. But the momentum was shifting. The lines were bending inward. The space between them was shrinking. The door was no longer wide open. Below is the continuation written to flow directly, maintaining documentary cinematic rhythm, no conclusions built for voiceover. Speed was no longer a concept. It was a weapon. On the ground, the movement did not feel fast. Columns crawled through dust and heat. Vehicles broke down. Men slept in short bursts beside the road. But on the map, the effect was violent. Lines that should have taken days to bend were curving within hours. Gaps that intelligence believed were secure were vanishing before reports could catch up. This was the part of war that rarely made it into doctrine. Not distance, but reaction time. Not territory, but awareness. Enemy reconnaissance lagged behind the maneuver. Reports moved upwards slowly, passing through layers that demanded confirmation before action. Each delay stole another hour. Each hour tightened the geometry of the movement. What the enemy saw as uncertainty was in reality acceleration. The commander measured progress not in kilometers, but in silence. The absence of coordinated resistance was itself a signal. Units encountered scattered opposition pockets of defense that had not yet been ordered to withdraw. These were not traps. They were leftovers waiting for instructions that would never arrive in time. Radio intercepts hinted at confusion, requests for clarification, contradictory orders, commands to hold positions that were already being bypassed. The enemy was reacting to a picture that no longer existed. Inside, the maneuver units operated on trust rather than confirmation. Tank crews advanced without knowing who was supposed to be on their flanks. Infantry pressed forward assuming armor would appear where it was expected, even when it had not yet arrived. This was not recklessness, it was compression, the kind that leaves no room for second thoughts. There were moments when the risk surfaced openly. A bridge reached later than planned. A column delayed by mechanical failure. A junction contested longer than anticipated. Each delay threatened to unravel synchronization. Each success restored it. The margin was never comfortable. Comfort was not the goal. As hours passed, the two arms of the movement began to sense each other's presence. Not visually, but through the pattern of resistance thinning ahead. The enemy was being pushed inward, compressed into a space shrinking faster than command could process. Higher headquarters attempted to reconstruct what was happening. The reports arriving were inconsistent. Some spoke of retreating German units. Others warned of a major envelopment forming. The contradiction slowed decision-making. No one wanted to be the first to admit the scale of the danger. By the time the reality became undeniable, options were already evaporating. Retreat required coordination. Coordination required time. Time no longer existed in sufficient quantity. The commander understood this phase as the most fragile, not because of enemy strength, but because of the temptation to slow down, to consolidate, to secure flanks, to tidy the maneuver into something recognizable. That impulse was resisted. Every pause widened the exit. Orders continued to emphasize momentum. Push forward, maintain contact, do not wait for perfection. The movement had to remain uncomfortable to stay alive. Night operations blurred the distinction between front and rear. Units crossed paths without formal acknowledgement. Supplies were rerouted mid-march. Decisions were made by junior officers without confirmation because waiting would have been more dangerous than acting. The map reflected it all. Two arcs nearing closure. A central mass no longer moving with purpose, only reacting. The battlefield was no longer a plane of advance, it was a mechanism. The enemy had not yet grasped the scale of what was forming. When they did escape, routes would already be measured in hours rather than distance, and hours were running out. The realization did not arrive as a single moment. It arrived in fragments. A report from one sector contradicted another. A retreat order reached a unit that could no longer move. Reconnaissance flights returned with photographs that did not align with yesterday's maps. What appeared to be isolated anomalies began to form a pattern no one wanted to name. At Soviet headquarters, the first assumption was deception. German forces were believed to be overextended, their movements improvised, their flanks vulnerable. The turning columns were interpreted as redeployment, not design. A temporary adjustment, a sign of hesitation. That assumption bought the maneuver more time than any fuel convoy ever could. Orders moved upward for approval. Approval required consensus. Consensus required confirmation. Confirmation required reports from units already under pressure. Each step slowed the response by hours. In a battle measured by minutes, those hours were fatal. Field commanders sensed danger before they were authorized to act. Some attempted local withdrawals without permission. Others held their ground, trusting that higher command would soon clarify the situation. That clarity never came in time. The system demanded obedience to procedure at the exact moment procedure became paralysis. As the situation worsened, language shifted. Reports stopped using terms like adjustment or redeployment. They began using words like breakthrough and threat. Even then, the scale was underestimated. Encirclement was considered possible, but partial, temporary. Something that could be reversed with decisive movement. But decisive movement requires coordination, and coordination requires a picture of reality. That picture was already obsolete. Communications faltered as units moved out of range or lost equipment. Rail lines clogged with traffic moving in both directions. Supply depots waited for orders that contradicted each other. Some formations were told to hold Kiev at all costs. Others were instructed to prepare for withdrawal without a defined route. Inside the pocket, confusion thickened. Units encountered German forces where none were expected. Roads thought to be open were suddenly blocked. Columns attempting to move east collided with other columns moving west, neither aware of the other's orders. The first attempts to break out were uncoordinated. Local attacks launched without air cover. Assaults planned on outdated intelligence. They met resistance not because German forces were overwhelming, but because they were already in place, waiting. The moment of recognition came too late for calm analysis. It arrived as fear. Maps were updated again and again, each revision shrinking the available space. What had been corridors became bottlenecks. What had been options became risks. Commanders began requesting permission not to maneuver, but simply to survive. From above, the scale of the disaster was still difficult to accept. The idea that entire armies could be sealed off so quickly clashed with every expectation. This was not how modern war was supposed to unfold. Not at this speed, not with this finality. But the reports no longer left room for doubt. Units were reporting contact on all sides. Ammunition was being rationed. Fuel was being burned to relocate command posts rather than advance. The initiative was gone, replaced by reaction. Inside the closing space, the war changed character. It was no longer about objectives or lines of advance. It became about endurance, about buying hours, about hoping for an opening that grew smaller with every message sent. What had begun as uncertainty hardened into something worse, the understanding that the trap was real, and that it was already closing. The confirmation did not come from a speech or an order. It came from a map that could no longer be corrected. At headquarters, the pins stopped moving outward. They began pressing inward, reports arriving from different sectors written hours apart, sent by different routes, now described the same reality. Contact on all sides. Roads cut, rail lines lost, air support requested, then canceled, then requested again with different coordinates. The picture stabilized into something no one wanted to acknowledge. The encirclement was no longer theoretical. On the ground, units felt it before they understood it. Patrols sent east returned from the west. Columns attempting to reposition ran into enemy forces moving in the opposite direction. The sense of orientation collapsed. Front and rear lost meaning. Every movement risked collision. Attempts to restore control accelerated the collapse. Orders designed for an open battlefield were issued into a closed one. Commands to regroup created congestion. Instructions to withdraw converged thousands of vehicles onto the same few roads. What had once been space became friction. Inside the pocket, time fractured. Some units were still following yesterday's plans. Others had already abandoned hope of coordinated movement. Command posts relocated repeatedly, burning fuel simply to stay connected. Radios carried more questions than answers. The chain of command stretched, thinned, and began to tear. From above, the final acknowledgement arrived not as panic, but as silence. Fewer directives, more requests for assessment. The system had reached the edge of its ability to respond. Anything decisive now would require time that no longer existed. On the outside of the ring, the movement tightened. Not dramatically, not with a surge, with pressure. Checkpoints established at crossings, artillery positioned to deny corridors. Reconnaissance focused not on pursuit, but on closure. This was no longer a maneuver in progress. It was a condition. The commander watched the map settle. Lines that had been fluid hardened. Gaps that had been measured in hours disappeared entirely. The geometry locked. What remained inside was fixed. There was no celebration. There was no declaration of victory. The scale of what had happened carried its own weight. Hundreds of thousands of men were now contained within a shrinking space, their fate bound to logistics rather than tactics. Ammunition would run out, fuel would vanish, food would thin. The battle would continue, but the campaign had already been decided. Messages began to change tone. Requests were framed not in terms of objectives, but necessity. Corridors were asked for, pauses were proposed, guarantees were sought. None could be given. The trap was not cruel because of how it closed. It was cruel because of how quietly it stayed shut. From this point forward, every action inside the pocket would be reactive. Every decision would be constrained. The initiative had moved entirely to the outside, where time worked in one direction only. The war in this sector had crossed a threshold. What remained was not uncertainty, but consequence. And consequence once reached does not negotiate. The scale revealed itself all at once. It was not discovered through a single report, but through accumulation. Prisoner counts exceeded expectations, then exceeded the ability to record them. Columns of captured soldiers stretched beyond reference points on the map. Aerial reconnaissance returned images that could no longer be reconciled with earlier estimates. What had been assumed to be multiple formations was in fact something closer to an entire field force erased from maneuver. At higher headquarters, the numbers were reviewed again and again. They did not change, they only grew. Each update confirmed what intuition had already accepted, and what doctrine had never allowed the encirclement, had swallowed an army measured not in divisions, but in populations. This was the moment when disbelief gave way to recognition. Maps were laid side by side, before and after. The difference was not subtle. Where movement had once been dense, there was now stillness. Where lines had overlapped, there was absence. Staff officers stared without speaking, aware that the consequences of this single maneuver would ripple across the entire front. On the German side, the reaction was restrained. There was no public triumph. The scale of the result carried too much gravity for that. What mattered was not the spectacle, but the effect. An entire sector of the opposing front had ceased to exist as a coherent fighting force. The southern theater was suddenly open in a way no planner had dared to predict. On the Soviet side, acknowledgement arrived more slowly. Reports were filtered, language was softened, losses were described as temporary dislocations. But internally, the truth could not be hidden. Entire commands were missing. Communication with multiple armies had ended. The absence was not tactical, it was structural. The strategic implications became unavoidable. With the Southern armies neutralized, reserves had to be diverted from other fronts. Defensive planning was rewritten under pressure. The timeline of the war shifted. What had been expected to slow the enemy now accelerated their options. This was the good God moment, though no one said it aloud. Not because of the number alone, but because of what the number represented. It was proof that modern war could still be decided by speed and judgment, not just mass. That systems designed to prevent catastrophe could, under the right pressure, enable it instead. For the commander who had ordered the movement, there was no pause for reflection. Success did not reduce responsibility. It increased it. The forces now trapped had to be contained, supplied against breakout attempts, and managed under conditions that could still turn volatile. The decision was no longer about possibility, it was about consequence. Beyond the battlefield, the campaign recalibrated itself. Allies adjusted expectations, opponents recalculated risks. Neutral observers began to understand that the war on the Eastern Front would not follow the gradual logic they had assumed. It would move in shocks. The encirclement became a reference point, not just a victory, a warning, a demonstration of how quickly the balance could tip when time, decision, and audacity aligned. History would later assign numbers, debates, and interpretations. But in that moment, standing over a map finally stripped of motion, the meaning was simpler. Something unprecedented had happened, and the war was now moving faster because of it. Victory did not simplify the war, it complicated it. The encirclement solved one problem and created several others. Hundreds of thousands of prisoners had to be guarded, fed, moved, and controlled. Units that had raced forward now had to stand still, stretched thin across a perimeter that could not afford to break. Ammunition that had been saved by maneuver was now consumed by containment. Fuel, once burned for speed, was redirected to endurance. The system felt the strain immediately. Supply officers warned of shortages. Commanders reported exhaustion. Vehicles that had been pushed beyond limits began to fail in clusters. The maneuver that had worked because of momentum now risked stalling under its own weight. A trap once closed still demanded constant attention. There were also voices of caution. Some argued the decision had gone too far, that it had invited unnecessary risk, that success had depended on enemy delay rather than German certainty. These concerns were not dismissed. They could not be. In war, even the correct decision carries the seeds of the next crisis, and yet the outcome could not be undone. An entire enemy force had been removed from the strategic equation in a matter of weeks. Not degraded, not delayed, neutralized. The Southern Front no longer dictated German movement. It responded to it. Timetables across the theater were rewritten. Operations once considered hazardous were now possible sooner than planned. The price for that acceleration was paid quietly, by soldiers who slept beside their vehicles for days at a time, by officers who carried the weight of decisions that had worked once and might never be forgiven if repeated, by a command system forced to admit that control had for a brief moment been surrendered in order to regain initiative. The war did not end here. It only intensified. But something fundamental had been demonstrated, not about ideology or superiority, but about the nature of conflict itself. Numbers alone do not decide outcomes. Neither does doctrine. What matters in compressed moments is the willingness to act when information is incomplete and the cost of delay is higher than the risk of movement. The commander who ordered the turn did not reshape history through brilliance alone. He did it by recognizing time as a finite resource and spending it ruthlessly. The system could not have made that choice. Only a human could. That is the uncomfortable truth of this campaign. For every rule written to prevent disaster, there exists a moment when following it guarantees one. For every plan designed to impose order, there comes a situation that demands disorder in exchange for advantage. The map eventually cleared. The lines moved on, new fronts opened, new disasters followed. But the imprint of this decision remained not as a lesson carved into doctrine, but as a question that still lingers over every command table. When the window is closing, when the system hesitates, when the cost of waiting becomes greater than the cost of acting, who decides? And if you were standing there watching the space on the map shrink by the hour, knowing that no rule could protect you from the outcome, would you have closed the door?